October 1962. For 13 days, the United States and Soviet Union came perilously close to nuclear war. We look back at lessons learned and how both superpowers managed to avoid a human catastrophe. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. "60 years ago, the world was on the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today, when humanity is threatened by the stockpile of nuclear warheads and armed conflicts, the unforgettable events of 1962 are a relevant reminder of an important lesson in human history. CGTN's Luis Chirino has more in this report.
U.S. President John F. Kennedy went on national television October 22, 1962, after U.S. pipeplanes flying over Cuba discovered nuclear missile sites under construction on the island.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The significance of the historic event was addressed in a recent online panel of Cuban and U.S. experts who recalled that Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev proposed Fidel Castro to deploy ballistic missiles in Cuba to counter a possible U.S. invasion, which triggered the conflict.
The response by Cuba, by Fidel Castro, was that we did not need missiles to defend ourselves. But if the missile deployment aimed to even the balance of forces between the socialist camp and the USA, Cuba was willing to pay the price.
But the worst did not happen, as Moscow and Washington reached a deal. The Soviet missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba, as would U.S. nukes from Turkey. The panelists recall that 60 years later, the world is threatened by more than 13,000 warheads spread across the globe. Peter Kornblue with the U.S. National Security Archive cited recent statements by U.S. President Joe Biden on the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a direct threat of the use of a nuclear weapon if things continue down the path they are going, he said.
Panelists said today's leaders should reconsider the lessons learned more than 6 decades ago.
There's a world trend of not learning from the past, and this is the result of the conflict and events in Ukraine.
The U.S. is the second biggest nuclear superpower with some 5,500 warheads. Russia has more than 6,200. Just last month, Cuba celebrated International Day for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. The government advocated the universal ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, stressing that nothing justifies such a threat to humanity. Luis Chirino, CGTN, Havana.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Cristina Escobar is a Cuban journalist and political analyst. Peter Kuznick is a history professor and the director of American University's Nuclear Studies Institute. Also with us is Pavel Felgenhauer. He's a defense analyst and columnist for Novaya Gazeta. And our correspondent, Luis Chirino, joins us from Havana as well. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And Luis Chirino, let me start with you. Cubans, of course, call this the October Crisis, the closest the world has come to nuclear war. With 60 years of hindsight and perspective, did it have to get to that point?
Okay, if you want to talk about the context in which the crisis took place, we, according to what we've read, according to experts, I would say we should not just look at the crisis itself as the only event that took place. There is a large context that the crisis took place in that is very related to the aggressive policy of the United States against Cuba since the revolution triumphed in 1959. There was a very large program launched by the Kennedy administration after the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which Cuba got the victory, the military victory over the United States. And this was a very hard point, I would say a stone in the shoes for Kennedy. And then they launched this a large program that included different kinds of wars, like, for instance, sabotage, There was also spy planes over the island all the time, and many other type of guerrilla wars in the mountains and things like that. It was called Operation Mongoose, which was aimed at ousting the Castro government in those times. It was a very large an aggressive policy or program that was ongoing at that time, when Russia or the president of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, asked Fidel Castro to bring the missiles here in Cuba. So it takes place in a context in which Cuba was defending from a lot of aggressive actions from the United States. That was the main context in which it took place.
And Luis, how is the crisis seen in Cuba today?
Unfortunately, the solution was found for the good of peace and for the sake of peace, all right? But unfortunately, Cuba was not allowed to take part in these accords that were reached between the Soviet Union and the United States, Kennedy and Khrushchev, I'm meaning. And that meant that Cuba was not able to demand the points that they wanted to do. That meant that, unfortunately, Cuba continued to be in the target, or that would continue to be the target of the United States' aggressive policies in different ways, which is maintained up to date. For instance, I would say that if Cuba had had the possibility of taking part of that accord, as Cubans see it from here now, from this point of view, this over 60-year trade embargo, which is now affecting in this minute the Cuban people very, very hard, will not be there, maybe.
Peter Kuznick, talking about context, what were the geopolitical reasons that got us up to that point in 1962?
I would start the story with the launch of Sputnik in 1957. And American leaders started to worry that there was a missile gap, that the United States was behind the Soviet Union. Soviets had tested the first intercontinental ballistic missile. Now they were launching satellites into space. Kennedy got elected in part on warning that Eisenhower and Nixon had let the United States fall behind the Soviets when it came to missiles. One of the first things that Eisenhower asked McNamara, Secretary of Defense, to do when they took office was to find out the reality. And McNamara quickly reported back that there was no missile gap. In October of '61, Roswell Kilpatrick made a speech written by Dan Ellsberg in which he says that there was a missile gap and it was in our favor. We were way ahead of the Soviets at that point. But by then, the Joint Chiefs of Staff was, the Strategic Air Command was asking for the U.S. to build 10,000 more intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Air Force wanted 3,000 more. McNamara figured the lowest number he could get away with was 1,000 more. Well, how did that look in the Kremlin? The Kremlin already knew that the U.S. was ahead 10 to 1 or more in terms of missiles and bombers, delivery systems. And now the U.S. was going to be adding 1,000 more. That was interpreted in the Kremlin that the U.S. was planning a first strike, surprise nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. So Luis put it in the context of the U.S. plans to overthrow the Castro government, which were going on at that point with Operation Mongoose and with a lot of military exercises. One of those exercises that was planned was named Operation Ortsac, and Ortsac is Castro, spelled backwards. But on top of that was this deep imbalance between the U.S. and the Soviets that the U.S. was intensifying. So Khrushchev said, now this will give you a taste of your own medicine. Now we can show you we can also swat your ass. Mm-hmm. So by putting the missiles in Cuba, it made a small dent in redressing the imbalance between the U.S. and the Soviets.
Peter, on the crisis itself, I mean, the world came very close to nuclear war at that point. Was there an awareness or a recognition on the part of the Kennedy administration at that time of what a nuclear war would do to the planet? It would effectively destroy the planet, and there would be no winners, really.
Yeah, Kennedy had a clear sense of that. He had gotten briefed several times on nuclear weapons. One of them, when Lemnitzer was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was detailing all of America's plans to wipe out the Soviet Union. Kennedy just walked out in the middle. Another one, when Lemnitzer was talking about U.S. plans for a preemptive first strike against the Soviet Union, Kennedy went out and commented to Dean Rusk, and we call ourselves a human race. Kennedy was very aware, as was Khrushchev. Khrushchev said when he was first briefed on nuclear weapons in 1953, he could not sleep for days. So we are very, very lucky that it was Kennedy and Khrushchev there, not Putin and Biden, in my opinion.
Pavel Felgenhauer, from Moscow's point of view, what were the reasons for deploying in Cuba what the United States saw as offensive weapons?
Well, some say it was because of the bad summit in Vienna between Kennedy and Khrushchev apparently had the notion that Kennedy was soft and that Russia could push the buck and get missiles deployed close to the United States and covering the United States, because Russia didn't have much intercontinental capability, which the United States did have, and that would level the field. And of course, there were American medium-range missiles in Turkey and Italy, and so that could also mean Russia believed that this could work out if the operation is made in secrecy, and then the Americans will be facing a fait accompli. It didn't fully work out like that. The warheads arrived in Cuba. The missiles R-12 also did and were deployed, but the longer range R-14 didn't get there. That means only part of the American mainland was covered by possible Russian attacks. And anyway, Russia was not really ready to go to full-out war with the United States.
Right. I want to go back to Havana. I want to go to Cristina Escobar. Cristina, great to have you with us. Of course, all of this happened before you were born. How did you learn of the crisis?
There's a black and white teaching of this story at school. So the actors were quite clear. Cuba was defending itself from a country that just a year before the missile crisis plotted an invasion from Bay of Pigs, which defeated and was an embarrassment for the American hegemony in the region. And it was very black and white, with not a lot of colors of how complicated this story was. Afterwards, when you talk to people that lived through those years, you understand that it was a moment in which Cuba was used as a stage, and the big guys made an agreement in the end, and it ended up as a gentleman's agreement in which Cuba again was left out. It reminds me of the Cuban-Spanish-American War, in which it's called in the American narrative the American-Spanish War, as it happened in the middle of nowhere, and it was happening in this country. And again, Cuba was left without the possibility of expressing their opinions and its opinion. And as a matter of fact, Fidel Castro gave a speech back then expressing the many reasons, the many points that it would have brought to the table if it would have had the opportunity of doing so. Like, for example, the withdrawal of the American forces from the naval base occupied in Guantanamo, and the fact that the embargo was in place was quite harsh on the Cuban economy, and still is. So the story of how we learn about it, it has two sides. So the very black and white, the victim and the bad guy at school, and then what people tell us about it. And it was lived with bravery and the sense of resistance. When you see these images in the United States of children going under the tables in schools because the world was about to end, in Cuba was lived as with the enthusiasm of resistance, of you know, defending the independence of sovereignty of the just triumphed Cuban Revolution.
Cristina, is the Cuban Missile Crisis an event that still preoccupies the Cubans, given, as you pointed out a moment ago, that the United States has imposed an embargo on Cuba, an embargo that is in effect up to this day, and the fact that the United States doesn't accept Cuba as a legitimate country, doesn't accept its leadership?
The thing is that the missile crisis, which by the way is called the Cuban Missile Crisis in the United States, but here is called the October Crisis, because back then we had crises like every month, different kinds of crises, and that's why it's called October Crisis here. But the interesting thing is that it ended for peace of the world, and gladly it ended. But actually Cuba was not safer because the regime of sanctions got worsened over the years. Now is tremendously harsh on the Cuban economy. Cuba is in a war is in a stage of war because of aggressions of the United States. It's not with bombardments or loaded aircrafts or warships on the seawall here in Havana that you could see from the streets. It's with economic pressure. And as a matter of fact, just recently, the ships that brought oil to Cuba from Venezuela, from different countries, were fined by the U.S. Treasury Department because of the sanctions. So it's not the traditional war that, as we saw back in the worst times of the Cold War, but still this country is under quite a severe system of sanctions that determines the reality and the political evolution of this country.
Peter Kuznick, President Kennedy at the time, he resisted pressure for full-scale invasion of Cuba. But in the end, of course, the Soviet Union did remove its missiles from Cuba, and the United States removed its missiles that were deployed in Turkey. So what were the lessons of that crisis?
Well, the lesson that was publicly articulated was that Kennedy was strong, he was firm, he was ready to go to war, and the Soviets backed down. As Dean Rusk says, we're eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow just blinked. So the lesson that was learned was that American toughness and vigilance and willingness to fight forced the Soviets to back down. The reality, of course, is that it was backroom deals, negotiations, diplomacy that got both sides to agree. And the lessons that they learned, Kennedy and Khrushchev both realized they had lost control. Pavel says that there were orders not to use those 100 battlefield nuclear weapons that were there, the tactical nuclear weapons, but there's no guarantee that they would not have been used by the commanders on the ground. Just like Khrushchev had given orders not to shoot down the U-2 planes, and still one got shot down on October 27th. So, but Kennedy and Khrushchev learned lessons. On October 30th, right after the crisis, Khrushchev wrote an extraordinary letter to Kennedy, and he said, "From evil, some good must come." He said, "Our people have felt the burning flames of thermonuclear war. We must end the arms race so this can never happen again." He said, "We must eliminate every conflict between us that could cause another crisis." It was very, very important, extraordinary statement. And Kennedy was slow to respond, but he finally did respond with the help of Norman Cousins, who went to see Khrushchev twice. And that's what led to the the atmospheric arms control agreement in 1963, which Kennedy was so proud of. Kennedy's American University commencement address in June of '63 effectively calls for ending the Cold War.
Yeah. Okay, Pavel Felgenhauer, let's move to the current crisis between Russia and the United States. Of course, the Soviet Union was broken up after the Cold War, and there are many experts, commentators, analysts who agree that this is a proxy war being fought between the United States and Russia, and Ukraine is being used as the battleground. President Putin made what many analysts called a veiled threat on the use of nuclear weapons. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Even nuclear blackmail has come into play. We're talking not only about the shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, encouraged by the West, which threatens to unleash a nuclear catastrophe, but also statements by some high-ranking representatives of leading NATO countries on the possibility of using weapons of mass destruction against Russia. Nuclear weapons. If the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will without question use all means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff.
So, Pavel, as I said, this was seen by many as a veiled threat to use nuclear weapons. The United Kingdom Prime Minister Liz Truss, while she was campaigning for that position, also said outright that she would use nuclear weapons against Russia. And the United States revoked its policy of no first use of nuclear weapons in April of this year. When we look at all of that, I mean, what lessons did they learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis at all?
What was learned is that nuclear weapons are a weapon of deterrence, and that's how they're being used by all sides. I mean, threats is what nuclear weapons are made for. They're, as Russian generals many times told me, these are not weapons for real use on the battlefield. These are weapons to be used for deterrence, meaning threat. So everyone is threatening to use nuclear weapons because the nuclear threshold is high, and it works. It works. It's called nuclear posturing, or it's balancing on the brink of nuclear war, nuclear brinkmanship. All sides do it. I mean, that's why they invested all those billions in those weapons. So that's not really threatening nuclear weapons, and using nuclear weapons is very different, and that was demonstrated in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
Then the difference between Russia, Soviet Union, and the United States was so huge. The United States could, and the chiefs of staff believed that if they invade Cuba and Soviet Union, Russia goes nuclear, that's okay because the United States is going to prevail. Thousands and maybe tens of thousands of nuclear warheads will devastate the Soviet Union, while only a handful would get to the United States territory. Though, of course, Europe and Asia most likely would be devastated too. That's what was rejected by Sorensen, Kennedy, McNamara. They went kind of soft.
Okay.
And this option disappeared in the 70s and the 80s when Soviet Union achieved nuclear parity that didn't exist in '62.
Peter Kuznick, we saw how the missile crisis in 1962 was resolved through quiet diplomacy, back-channel diplomacy, low-key diplomacy. Is there a lesson in there to use that same style of diplomacy to resolve the current crisis in the Ukraine, or are the divisions too deep right now? Is there too much mistrust?
I think we absolutely need that kind of diplomacy. I think it should begin immediately. So far, the Biden administration has largely given Zelensky a blank check and told Zelensky that we will go along with whatever he chooses to do in terms of negotiating and compromising. The Biden administration should instead be using whatever leverage it has to convince Zelensky to go to the negotiating table. China and India and other countries have got to put the same pressure on Putin to negotiate now. This is just too dangerous a situation. What we know about nuclear war is that if it starts on a large scale, then it affects everybody on the planet. It's not only Americans and Russians and Ukrainians. Everybody is going to be threatened with annihilation because of nuclear winter if this continues. So yeah, negotiations are the only path out of this, and it has to begin quickly. And back in '62, Kennedy was always open to diplomacy. He was often the only one in the room who was opposed to bombing the missile sites and invading and overthrowing Castro. And so we need that same kind of leadership, that same kind of wisdom, that same kind of looking for peaceful solutions, because it's a humanitarian disaster on the ground right now. And it's, we have to end it as quickly as possible. And if that means compromising, then that's the answer right now. And we had that basis before. We had the Minsk II agreements. We had other bases for negotiating. But neither side now wants to compromise. Zelensky says we don't want to give in, let the Russians have an inch of Ukrainian territory. I can understand why they feel that way, but it's just too dangerous a situation now.
Cristina Escobar, what is the current relationship between Cuba and Russia right now? Is it still an ideological, brotherly relationship like it was during the Cold War, or are those days long gone?
No, I don't think the situation is the same. And Russia is a capitalist country, and I do believe it respects the Cuban sovereignty as Cuba does to Russia. But I do believe the commercial links, the sense of helping each other when needed, is still there. As a matter of fact, during COVID-19 pandemic, in this country was a huge crisis because of a lack of oxygen for people in hospitals, admitted to hospital. And the Cuban government tried to purchase ventilators to the United States, and because of the sanctions, it was not possible. And Russia was one of the countries that rushed into filling this void of helping Cuba to get oxygen and to bring medical oxygen to patients suffering from COVID-19. So it's an example of how Russia has helped because of humanitarian reasons Cuba many times, and the United States has lost this opportunity time and again, losing also the opportunity of being part of the Cuban reality. And we've had, unfortunately, several crises in the last months that would have been a perfect opportunity for the United States to help Cuba, thinking about humanitarian aid and human rights of the Cuban people, which is the official discourse, the idea that they're thinking about the human rights of the Cuban people. This is not coherent when you see it in practice. That's why I do believe that although the relations are good and there is a sense of consistency of the foreign policy of Cuba in the UN with Russia, it's not, I wouldn't say it's not an open discourse for the war in Ukraine, for the crisis in Ukraine, because as a matter of fact, in the beginning of the crisis, Cuba said very clearly that was against all types of violence and, as a matter of fact, against wars, but defending the right of Cuba, or the right of Russia to defend its own sovereignty. I do believe Cuba, since the missile crisis, which one of the lessons learned by this country is, one, the fact that the sovereignty and independence of Cuba, you shouldn't rely on any other power because it's on us. We were left alone in the missile crisis. They agreed by themselves and left Cuba alone. And the other part is that the sovereignty and the respect to other countries is essential for the peace of the world. And I do believe that a lot of countries, when you see the link with other countries, is not, I wouldn't say, is an ideological partnership of match. I do believe it's functional and it's beneficial for both ways, but it's not as it was back in 1962.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.